Hi, everyone. I hope you are having a great day. Welcome to the Wednesday, April 1st lecture of Media and Politics. I'm recording this on Tuesday night, and I'm currently outside on my back porch. And there are a few planes flying overhead, surprisingly, actually. So if you can hear any background noise, that's probably it. So, anyway, on tap for today, just wanted to give y'all a quick update as to sort of where we stand and how things are going. And then we'll finish our discussion of mediated presidential campaigns by talking through a couple of articles. So the first was this The Real Story of 2016, written by Nate Silver from 538. We'll talk a little bit about the article, a little bit about who Nate Silver is, and 538's approach to journalism. And then I wanted to talk for a few minutes at least about this really interesting article called One Person's History of Twitter from Beginning to End. And you may kind of be wondering, why did he assign this during a week on how presidential campaigns communicate with the public? As you may imagine, if you haven't yet read the article, it does talk about clearly Trump's relationship to Twitter. But what I found interesting about this piece is it kind of reverses our normal thinking. So it doesn't necessarily talk about the medium of communication from the candidate's perspective, but instead from the perspective of somebody who exists on the website as well, right? And is involved in that particular social media platform and the sort of impacts that changes in that platform and how it kind of facilitated Trump's campaign, the impacts that it had on him and his use of Twitter. All right, so jumping into the real story of 2016. If you're unfamiliar with 538, it was a blog actually started by an economist and baseball writer, actually, in 2008, named Nate Silver. And he published this blog anonymously and ended up using some already sort of established methods, but bringing them kind of to the public for the first time, to weight polls done at the state level normally. And so he weighted polls in the 2008 presidential election in order to come up with a better forecasting model for who was going to win the election. And he ended up not only predicting Barack Obama's victory in 2008, but almost down to the exact number of electoral college votes that Obama ended up earning. And so Nate Silver was kind of courted by a bunch of different outlets. He ended up writing for the New York Times for a while, and then has since started this website called 538.com. And the name 538 comes from, of course, the number of electoral college votes that are up for grabs. So anyway, it's a really interesting website. He writes about politics, writes about sports, culture, all sorts of things, but does so from a data-driven perspective rather than kind of an anecdotal perspective. And he writes this piece that I signed. He wrote it in January of 2017, so a few months after Trump was elected, but right before he was inaugurated. And he tried to sort of get a handle on why so much of the national media seemed blindsided by Trump's victory in 2016. And he comes up with some actually pretty interesting conclusions. So he talks about how nowadays, when it comes to political reporting on presidential campaigns, campaign correspondents very rarely stick to this like just the facts style of reporting. And I think that in some ways that's a false choice. I'm not sure campaign correspondents ever really stuck with the just the facts style of reporting, right? Like the rally started at 3 p.m. It took place in a brown building. There were 1,000 people there, blah, blah, blah. Like that is sort of, I think, kind of missing the point of journalists. And obviously, even if it is a just the facts style of reporting, well, then the question becomes which facts do you include and which facts do you not include? And that sort of framing comes in and priming comes in and agenda setting and everything else. But he does Silver in this article raises the good point that editors and reporters, even if they're not conscious of this, they're making judgments constantly about the state of the horse race. And I know we've talked about the horse race before, but remember, the horse race is a metaphor of like two horses, obviously, who are sort of going down the home stretch, and one's pulling ahead, and then the other's pulling ahead, and then it's back to the first horse who's winning, and so back and forth, who's winning, who's losing. So the sort of state of the race at any given point, that's what horse race reporting is about. But at any rate, editors and reporters just have to make judgments about the horse race in order to decide which stories to cover and where to devote resources. And we see this in particular when it comes to crowded presidential fields. So, for example, the Democratic nomination, the race for the Democratic nomination, you saw national media really start to sort of move away from covering candidates when it became clear that they weren't going to have a shot at winning. We saw this happen to Elizabeth Warren's campaign in particular. And so editors and reporters are constantly worried about the horse race, right? Because they don't want to misallocate their own resources. And what this means, though, is that as they're sort of constantly calculating chances for victory, it means that, of course, they can be wrong. And Silver claims, in fact, that in 2016, if you go look at the reporting in the days running up to the election, the Washington Post's reporting made it clear that some of their opinion writers in particular were prepared for a Trump victory. They thought that it was plausible, whereas the journalists who were working at the New York Times seemed to not really think about that being even a possibility. So as it turns out, Trump outperformed his national polls by only like 1 to 2 percentage points. And so one kind of common theme about the 2016 election is that the media got it really wrong and that the polls got it really wrong. Really, they didn't overall. However, there was much more of a difference in swing states. So like Florida, as it turns out, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. So there was more of a difference in swing states where Trump tended to outperform his polls by sometimes double what he was outperforming his national polls by, so 2 to 3 points. And he beat the polls by a large amount in 3 states in particular: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And we're often, those 3 states are sort of often lumped together because his margin of victory in all 3 was pretty small. I think less than 100,000 votes in each state. And his victory in those 3 states essentially ensured his victory in 2016. So why then was the media so blindsided by Trump's win if really the polls were not that far off? Like, what could have happened that led the media to being so kind of gobsmacked by Trump's victory? So Silver cites a couple of factors, several factors really. He talks about a pervasive groupthink among media elites, and I think that this groupthink, if you're unfamiliar with this term, it's where sort of an entire group or category of people, they kind of coalesce around thinking about the state of the world in one particular way, when in fact we know that the world is a very nuanced and kind of state of gray place. And I think there's a bunch of reasons why groupthink exists, particularly among the Washington and campaign media. So for one thing, they're all located usually in the same place, which is either in Washington, D.C., or in New York. They know most of the same people. They come from sort of the same world, the same income bracket, the same sort of cosmopolitan East and West Coast type of outlook. And I think that those people in particular were very, very surprised that Trump won. Whereas if you were living in rural Texas or, economically depressed rural Michigan, for example, a Trump victory would have been less implausible to you. Second, the media tends to have an unhealthy obsession with the insider's view of politics. And one thing that insiders always fail to appreciate fully is how much an outsider may be about to upend whatever system it is that they're living in. And in this case, political insiders, I think for many reasons, and sort of lack of imagination being one of them, but for many reasons, they considered a Trump victory to be not possible, right? He had held no elected political office, never, unless you've got significant war experience, are you able to have your first elected office be the presidency of the United States. He had obviously said outlandish things. He'd been involved in personal scandals. And so, to the political insider, a Trump election was not only unlikely, it looked impossible. Also, journalists, and in particular campaign journalists, tend to report with a lack of analytical rigor, at least according to Silver. They do a poor job of understanding probabilities, and they do a poor job of understanding uncertainty. And failure to appreciate uncertainty is his fourth factor as to why the media was so surprised. Fifth, the media, like a lot of groups, tend to have a sluggishness to self-correct when new evidence contradicts pre-existing beliefs. And this, by the way, may be true for the media, but I think that this criticism that Silver levies against the media is really a criticism of human nature. We all tend to have our own biases and our own predilections that kind of come into play when we're faced with information that potentially disconfirms things that we think about the world. And I think that's a failing of humans, but of course it's also a failing of journalists. And finally, they tend to lack some perspective from the longer arc of American history. And I confess to being guilty of this in 2016 as well. I also predicted that Trump would lose in 2016. And I think it was really a failure of imagination on my part. I took a look at the Obama coalition from 2008 and 2012, and even though the coalition shrunk in 2012 from what it was in 2008, I think I really failed to appreciate the sort of stressors that the Great Recession had put onto the system and people's sort of disgust with politics as usual. And, that's always dangerous when you study politics, because you sort of, when you study anything, you kind of fail, at least maybe I fail, to understand people's disdain for the topic. So I think all of these concerns about political journalism are really well founded by Nate Silver, and I found them actually pretty compelling. So while polls for the most part did show Hillary Clinton with an advantage as the 2016 campaign neared its conclusion, the polls had her chances of winning as varying dramatically. So, one poll gave her a chance of 99 in 100 of winning. Another gave her a 7 in 10 chance. And the difference there, even though those look like close numbers, one is actually 30 times more likely than the other. And so what journalists, and this is probably going back to his kind of lack of analytical rigor, journalists tended to lump all of these together because they all showed that Clinton was favored, even if in some states she was favored by very little, right? So it wouldn't take much for the polls to be wrong. And of course, we have a winner-take-all political system in the Electoral College. So you can win a state by one vote, and you, of course, get all of that state's Electoral College votes. One other thing that the media failed to consider was the impact of FBI Director James Comey's letter that he released to Congress on October 28th, so about 10 days before the election. And this letter was hugely important because it immediately sort of cast doubts on Hillary Clinton's email scandal, which she had hoped had been kind of put behind her and put to rest. And most media kind of either misunderstood or either didn't understand at all, maybe, that much of the polling data shifted toward Trump. Maybe not enough to actually favor him winning, but toward him in the aftermath of that letter. And of course, the media's coverage of the letter was also a part of why the polls shifted, which then the media failed to report. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about like covering media and politics is tricky, right? Because Of course, the letter existed. That was a reality. But the reality of the letter's existence was amplified by mass media for many people. So while the media was reporting on the existence of the letter, it was their reporting, in addition to the actual letter, that was changing people's minds and making people doubt Hillary Clinton's viability as a candidate. So, what did explain Trump's victory? Silver's got a couple reasons. So the first is that background conditions were actually pretty favorable for Trump. Of course, it's quite hard for any political party, Democrat or Republican, to win the White House for 3 consecutive terms. And after 2 terms of Barack Obama, a Clinton victory would have been the 3rd in a row for Democrats. Demographics also tended to favor Trump, particularly in the Electoral College. And I find this to be actually a pretty compelling argument, but white voters who do not have college degrees, so with a high school education or less, make up Trump's political base. And these voters are disproportionately concentrated in what turned out to be swing states, so Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, etc. And voter preferences over the course of the election tended to change substantially based on news events. And the news cycle ended on a downturn for Clinton, right? So it had been up, it had been down, it had been up, it had been down, and it ended on a downturn. If the election had been 2 weeks earlier or even 2 weeks later, who's to say what would have happened? So all of this sort of begs the question, and something we'll talk about a little bit later, is I'm curious as to what you guys think Trump's chances for re-election are this November. And I know that the pandemic has raised all sorts of questions about everything, really everything in American life. Politics, of course, just being one facet of this. And I think I kind of promised I would put away my crystal ball after blowing it in 2016. So I don't even want to predict what's going to happen in November. But I do know that Trump's election in 2016 seems like a long time ago, and that a lot of water has traveled under the bridge since then. So I think I haven't figured out what our next discussion board post is going to be, but it might have something to do with this topic about thinking about coverage of the Trump campaign and coverage of his presidency and what it might suggest for his chances for re-election in 2020. All right, so I want to switch gears now, and this is kind of an interesting little article, I thought. And after reading the Nate Silver piece, which is sort of this broad, overarching view of the media landscape in the 2016 presidential election, this is basically just one guy's blog post about his experience with the social media platform of Twitter. And you may be wondering, like, why did Dr. Hebron include this reading here of all places? And hopefully we can explore that question a little bit. So one thing that I found really interesting were the sorts of adjectives that Montero uses to describe Twitter in his sort of early days of using it. He talks about its community spirit. He talks about how it was empowering. It allowed him as an introvert to come out of his shell a little bit. How it was funny. He met people, came across people who were really funny, and it made him funny, and it made him a better writer, and it made him smarter, and it made him more well-informed. And, we see this a lot. We've talked about this a lot in class, but there's some kind of utopia aspect whenever these new technologies come onto the scene, right? And whether it's, a part of a new, Twitter, of course, is not a new technology. It's part of the internet. But this idea that the internet is going to be the great leveler and is going to be a place where the best of humanity comes to flourish. I think in some ways that's true, but like anything else, it really reflects all of human nature, the good and the bad. And the Montero, who's ended up kind of being friends in San Francisco with a lot of the people who were really influential in starting Twitter, talked about how their goal was to basically give everyone a voice. And of course, as a tech company, they wanted to monetize those voices too, but giving everyone a voice. And he says, yet they were so obsessed with giving everyone a voice that they never stopped to wonder what would happen once everybody got one. And I think that quote's really interesting, right? Because we tend to think of the First Amendment and free speech rights in American politics as granting everybody a voice. It's not really true, though. I mean, it grants us the ability to have a voice, um, but it does not grant us the voice itself. And I think we've talked about this with respect to Facebook or whatever, but when the New York Times and some conspiracy theorists, they both make a Facebook post or update their status on Facebook, it's going to look the same for the most well-trained journalists in the world as it does for your crazy uncle who believes that we never landed on the moon. And I think that the flattening out of expertise in this way is very problematic. Um, and the sort of democratizing of voices in some ways is very problematic as well. Oops. So Montero talks about the goal of every company that's venture-backed, and venture-backed companies. What that phrase means is that they're backed by venture capitalism, venture capitalists. So what these people are they're usually wealthy individuals or they work for a hedge fund, and they look for new technologies and new companies to invest money in. So when companies like Twitter are early startups, they don't make any money, but of course they have great potential. And they need money to scale up and they need money to operate. And so they go try to raise money among these venture capitalists. And so the goal of every venture-backed company is to increase usage, right, by some metric, end over end, until the people who gave you, as the founder, startup capital get paid. And in the run-up to 2016, Montero suggests that Twitter had sort of plateaued. And it had plateaued in terms of attracting new users and in terms of sort of being a vibrant place for political discourse. And that Trump, not only Trump as a candidate, but before that, not only Trump as president, but before that as a candidate, and before that as sort of a private citizen, albeit a very famous private citizen with a following, helped to reinvigorate the platform. But Montero says that it actually came at great cost, and that Twitter, by wanting to appear to be objective, and not sort of quelling racism, hate speech, etc., that was pervading the platform during the 2016 election, they actually did end up silencing voices. And the voices that they ended up silencing were the people who faced abuse at the hands of some of the sort of Trump Twitter lynch mob. And I liked this quote. I mean, it's disturbing, but I liked it. He says, "Twitter today is a cesspool of hate, a plague of frogs. 10 years ago, a group of white dudes baked the DNA of the platform without thought to harassment or abuse. They built the platform with the best of intentions. I still believe this, but they were ignorant to their own blind spots, as we all are. This is the value of diverse teams, by the way. When you're building a tool with a global reach, and who isn't these days, your team needs to look like the world it is trying to reach. And 10 years later, the abuse has proven too much to fix." So why did I include this article in this week's reading? Basically because the tools that politicians use to communicate with us have consequences. They have consequences not only for how future presidents communicate with some future version of us, but they also have consequences for us in real time. And they have consequences for how we learn about the world, how we interact with each other in a sort of a civic and political space. And they have a consequence on the sort of state of political discourse in America. And I think that the author is exactly right, that Twitter, if you sort of gave its founders, truth serum or something, they may not like Donald Trump's politics, but they certainly like the attention that he's drawn to their website and to their platform. And I thought it was really interesting sort of thinking about other technologies and how they would have evolved. But if you think about television, for example, the early days of TV, it was seen obviously as this incredibly powerful medium that could bring moving images into your living room. Seemed like utopic. People could learn about the world without traveling to the world. They could see different places. They could see different cultures. And of course, some people do and did use television for that, right? But television is also used, of course, to spread the worst parts of humanity, racism and xenophobia and anger and hate. And it's just really interesting, I think, as somebody who cares about media and politics and tries to think about these things critically, to see how the world sometimes repeats itself. So that's why I included this reading in this week's class, and I hope that you found it interesting. And similarly, I hope that you're all doing well. I hope you've been reading the Chancellor's email updates. I have, and normally, I work at TWU, so, um, you know, I got to be honest. Sometimes the emails that are sent out campus wide, I don't always read them, but I have been reading her updates, and I've actually found myself really comforted by them. And I've noticed they've taken on a bit of a different tone this week, kind of talking about how we're all, in some sense, grieving. For what's going on. And maybe that's true for you, maybe it's not. I don't know if y'all are grieving these sort of changes that have taken place for your academic semester. But I know that I have, and I know that it's been kind of a bummer for me, at least, to realize that we're probably not going to meet in person again to discuss media and politics. And I think that, this remote learning and online learning, whatever we're calling it, it's got some benefits for sure. I've got to admit, it's actually really nice not having to drive all the way from Dallas to Denton 4 times a week and back. But I really miss seeing you guys a lot, and I appreciate it when you reach out and when you let me know how you're doing. Um, and I hope you're all doing well. And I guess that's it for me tonight. So hope you have a great day. Hope you have a great rest of the week. And feel free to email me if you have any questions about anything. Otherwise, I'll see you on YouTube next week. All right.